A society on the eve of revolution or absolute catastrophe is analogous to a volcano on the verge of eruption. For years, decades, or even centuries, the lava boils beneath the surface. It is invisible to those walking upon the crust, yet the pressure mounts. And when it finally breaches the crater, the revolutionary ejecta comes raining down, setting fire to everything it touches. This ejecta is never made of just one element. It is a lethal, molten mixture of economic misery, political frustration, religious corruption, and deep moral deterioration. By the year 1789, the Kingdom of France was infected with all these pathogenic elements. And worse, it had zero immunity left to fight them off. The eminent historian François-René de Chateaubriand observed this volatile mixture perfectly when he wrote, "The French Revolution sprang from a combination of intellectual ferment and material grievances, and it was the intellectual ferment that made the material grievances more fiercely resented." Towards the end of the 18th century, the entire European continent was shaken to its core by an uprising staged by the French people against autocracy and aristocracy. It began, officially, with the fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, and it would not truly end until a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte rose from the ashes to seize power. This event remains one of the ultimate landmarks in human history. But why? The English revolutions of 1672 and 1688 were largely political and religious disputes. The American Revolution of 1776 was a political separation. But the French Revolution was a total, all-encompassing upheaval. It was political, social, religious, and economic. It did not just want to change the government, it wanted to sweep away every existing institution and build a completely egalitarian society from the ground up. For nearly 200 years, the government in France had been a one-man institution. This was the era of the despotic Bourbon kings. In earlier centuries, the 14th, 15th, and 16th, France had a semblance of a parliament known as the Estates General, composed of representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. But after 1614, the monarch simply stopped summoning them. By the late 18th century, the king was the sole repository of sovereign power. He didn't just rule the state, he was the state. Louis XVI could do almost anything his imperious will dictated. There was no fear of impeachment. There were no legislative restrictions. Concepts of constitutionality or the natural rights of his subjects simply did not exist in the royal vocabulary. If the king wished to throw a man into prison without a trial, he simply issued a royal order, a lettre de cachet. He could clamp a rigid censorship on the press or restrict freedom of speech on a whim. However, we must view this tyranny through the lens of reality. In actual practice, during the reigns of Louis XV and Louis XVI, there was comparatively little direct interference with what men wrote or said. The monarchy was too inefficient for total totalitarianism. No action of these monarchs successfully inhibited the mordant wit of Voltaire or suppressed the radical, paradigm-shifting books of Rousseau. The true tyranny was not in constant oppression, but in the absolute, messy incompetence of the state. Confusion reigned in nearly every department of the government. It was a hotbed of nepotism. Prized administrative posts were handed out like party favors to aristocrats and nobles who entirely lacked the art, capacity, and ability to rule. The laws of the land were completely freakish. There was no unified French legal code. The eminent historian Charles Hazen noted that what was completely lawful in one town might be highly illegal in a village not 5 miles away. Almost 400 distinct bodies of law were in force across different parts of France. Into this administrative chaos stepped state officials who were notorious for maltreating the commoners. They inflicted unimaginable financial and physical horrors on the populace, and because there was no unified legal system, there was absolutely no check on their power. But bad administration alone rarely causes a revolution. Revolutions are not made by sporadic attacks upon a system still in its prime. Before a great political and social upheaval can occur, there must be a near-total collapse of the existing order. And nothing collapses an empire faster than disastrous, long, and expensive wars. Throughout the 18th century, France was plunged into a series of catastrophic global conflicts. The first to truly prepare the ground for revolution was the 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763 under Louis XV. This was effectively the world's first global war. France found itself pitted against the rising powerhouse of England and the military discipline of Prussia. Despite securing alliances with Austria and temporarily Russia, France suffered an overwhelming, humiliating defeat. The French were forced to surrender nearly all of their lucrative colonial possessions in North America and India to the British. The French public rightly placed the blame for this geopolitical catastrophe squarely on the incompetence of their government. The aura of French invincibility was shattered. But the fatal blow came a decade later. Driven by a desire for revenge against the British, Louis XVI decided in 1778 to intervene in the American War of Independence. France was finally on the winning side, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of maintaining those fleets and armies in the Western Hemisphere for over 3 years virtually bankrupted the Bourbon government. It is a profound historical irony. An absolute monarch bankrupted his own autocratic regime to fund a democratic revolution across the ocean. This condition of utter financial helplessness, facing an impossible burden of debt, led directly to the fatal conflict between the king and his own people. To understand the friction this debt caused, we must look at who actually held the wealth in France and who paid the taxes. The emergence of a new economic group with a sense of grievance is a necessary condition for any revolution. A successful revolution is rarely staged solely by the miserable dregs of humanity, people who are starving, wretched, and hopeless. A revolution requires a class permeated by a sense of confidence, people who have tasted success and believe they deserve more. In France, this was the bourgeoisie, the middle class. During the years of relative prosperity preceding the Revolution, the French bourgeoisie had grown to be the dominant economic engine of the nation. Aside from raw land ownership, nearly all the productive wealth was in their hands. They controlled the resources of trade, manufacturing, and international finance. In 1789, the foreign commerce of France reached an unprecedented 1.15 billion francs. But this rising prosperity only sharpened their discontent. Imagine being a brilliant lawyer, a massive manufacturer, or a banker who funds the state's debts. No matter how much money you acquired, you were excluded from political privileges. You had zero influence at the court of Versailles. You could not hold the highest military or political honors. You could not even vote. Worse, you were looked down upon by an idle, frivolous nobility that contributed nothing to the nation's economy. The commercial and industrial leaders of France demanded political power commensurate with their economic position. This demand is what made the bourgeoisie a truly revolutionary class. While the bourgeoisie resented their lack of power, the peasants simply resented their lack of bread. The taxation system in France was a masterclass in inequity. Direct taxes on income imposed by the king swallowed 10 to 15% of a peasant's gross product. The tithes, meant for the upkeep of the local clergy, took another 8%. Then came the corvée, a brutal system requiring 14 days of forced, unpaid physical labor on the nation's roads, dragging farmers away from their fields when they were needed most. The major tax placed on all French subjects was the taille, a heavy land tax. Yet, miraculously, the incredibly wealthy church, most of the towns, and the nobility were entirely exempt from it. The commoners were bled dry by indirect taxes, the poll tax per head, the aids on food and drink, the octroi on goods brought into towns, and the universally hated gabelle, a crippling tax on salt, a strict necessity used to preserve meat for the winter. And because France was bankrupted by the American Revolution, the king levied the vingtième, an emergency war tax of about 5% on income, pushing the peasantry past the breaking point. At the top of this pyramid of suffering sat a queen who would become the ultimate symbol of royal disconnect: Marie Antoinette. The daughter of the famous Maria Theresa of Austria, Marie Antoinette was luxurious, frivolous, and dangerously out of touch. She dominated the weak-willed Louis XVI, bending him to her whims whether they were just or unjust. While the nation's economy spiraled into the abyss, she did not restrain herself from squandering fortunes on fashion, gambling, and absurd court theatricals. To the starving commoners, she was a foreign parasite. They dragged her honor through the mire, calling her ugly names and dubbing her Madame Deficit. As the historian Robertson noted, to Marie Antoinette, France seemed only a bottomless purse to be drained for her pleasure. Nature itself soon turned against the Bourbons. A terrible famine raged through France in 1788 and 1789. Crops failed. The winters were brutally cold. Thousands died of sheer starvation. While the king called political meetings at his lavish palace in Versailles, the streets of Paris were wallowing in abysmal penury. Hungry, freezing citizens crowded the metropolis looking for any scrap of employment. A rumor began to spread like wildfire. The king and queen were hoarding the nation's grain at Versailles. Driven by the primal instinct of survival, a massive, unruly mob stormed the royal mansion. They slaughtered the guards, breached the palace, and forced the king, the queen, and their son to. From that moment on, the absolute monarch of France was effectively a hostage of his own people. If the political system was corrupt, the socio-economic front was entirely stratified by deep, unmovable fault lines. As it has been said, the Revolution of 1789 was much less a rebellion against despotism than a rebellion against inequality. French society was rigidly divided into three distinct social classes, known as the estates. The first estate was the clergy. Numbering hardly 1% of the population, the Roman Catholic Church owned a staggering 20% of all the land in France. They enjoyed massive privileges, high offices, and total exemption from standard taxes, contributing a mere 2% of their income to the government as a voluntary gift. The higher clergy, bishops, and archbishops lived in palaces, enjoying a luxury indistinguishable from the royal court. But there was a fatal fracture within the First Estate itself. While the 134 bishops lived like kings, the 60,000 parish priests of the lower clergy lived in grinding poverty. Recruited mostly from the peasantry, they earned barely enough to survive. They despised the hypocrisy of their wealthy superiors and deeply sympathized with the commoners. When the revolution finally broke, these local priests powerfully aided the popular cause. The second estate was the nobility. This class was also deeply divided against itself. At the top was the great nobility. About 1,000 families who lived at Versailles owned another 20% of the land and paid almost no taxes. They monopolized all senior officer roles in the army and navy, the upper judiciary, and the high church. Below them were the lesser nobility, comprising about 99,000 families. They lived on country estates, struggling to maintain their status at Versailles. Frustrated by their exclusion from high political life, many of these lesser nobles actually supported the early stages of the revolution. The third estate was everyone else. About 97% of the French population belonged to the third estate, a massive, diverse group bound only by their shared lack of privilege. It included the wealthy, Enlightenment-reading bourgeoisie at the top. It included the urban workers of the cities, apprentices, laborers, and servants who starved when the price of bread rose. and it included the massive peasantry, comprising over 80% of France's 25 million people, who surrendered half their income to the nobles, the church, and the king. As the old French maxim went, "The nobles fight, the clergy pray, the people pay." The dry tinder of inequality was ready. It just needed a spark. That spark came from the intellectuals, and ironically, from the army itself. By 1789, the French army was no longer the blind, reliable instrument of monarchy it had been under Louis XIV. A 1781 law had restricted all commissioned officer ranks strictly to the nobility. The educated sons of the bourgeoisie could only ever become non-commissioned officers. Furious at this glass ceiling, secret democratic societies began to form within the military regiments, fatally undermining their discipline. Furthermore, thousands of French soldiers had just returned from the American War of Independence. They had fought alongside George Washington. They had absorbed the democratic ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the fiery writings of Thomas Paine. They returned to a homeland where they had no representation and where aristocratic officers could legally beat them with the flat of a sword. The American War had opened their eyes. Now they brought the revolution home. Simultaneously, the great philosophy, the intellectual justifications for the monarchy. Thinkers like Diderot and D'Alembert spent 20 years compiling the famous Encyclopédie. This was not just a dictionary, it was a weapon. Featuring contributions from giants like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, it attacked the divine right of kings, religious intolerance, and social inequality. Despite government bans, imprisonment, and censorship, the ideas spread. The French bourgeoisie began to look across the English Channel. They read the English philosopher John Locke. They admired England's constitutional monarchy, their freedom of the press, and their relatively balanced society. The intellectual ferment had reached a boiling point. Louis XVI, realizing the danger too late, attempted to save his kingdom. He appointed brilliant financial minds like Turgot and the Swiss banker Necker. Turgot tried to abolish purchased government positions, eliminate the forced labor of the corvée, and allow free trade in grain to prevent famines. Necker tried to slash the exorbitant spending of the court at Versailles, which consumed 1/12 of the entire national budget. But the system was too corrupt to save itself. Every time reform was proposed, Marie Antoinette and the great nobility conspired to crush it. They refused to surrender a single tax exemption or privilege. Turgot was dismissed. Necker was fired, replaced, and then recalled only when it was entirely too late. Bankrupt, starving, and paralyzed by a stubborn aristocracy, Louis XVI was left with no options. In a final desperate move to prevent total state collapse, he called for the compiling of cahiers, lists of grievances from the provinces, and summoned the Estates General to meet in May of 1789. The volcano was about to erupt.